Welcome to Live Daf, your online Daf Yomi Shiur.
Shalom Aleichem and welcome back to today's Daf Yomi, which is Eruvin Daf Tes Zayin. We have 5 lines from the top. Says the Gemara, Toshma. We are middle of our discussion regarding a mechitza, which has oimid and parts. It has a built portion and also an empty portion, empty space. So it depends how much there is. If in the final analysis of this mechitza there is more standing, more oimid than parts, than the gaps, then certainly this mechitza is a kosher mechitza, it's valid. If there is more parts, more gaps in total than the oimid, this mechitza is batal. What if it's half and half? So it's half oimid and half parts. We have a machlokes. Rav Papa says it's okay. Rav Huna Bar Yishua says no. The area, since it isn't mostly enclosed, it's only half enclosed, that's not considered to be a contained area. This mechitza is possible. Says the Gemara on the 5th line from the top, Tashma. Come and hear a raya with regard to this machlokes. This is a brisa that's concerning kilayim. So if we have a mechitza, one can go ahead and plant 2 minim, one species on either side of that mechitza, and there's no concern of confusion of kilayim. Says the brisa, Nintzis as ato imer. So it turns out that there are actually shalosh midos mechitzas, 3 separate categories when it comes to mechitzas. Mechitzas that have gaps. Number 1, kol shu pachos mishloisha. If the gap is in a mechitza where the boards or the slats that are being used are narrower than 3 tfachim, and we have gaps in between these boards, tzorech shelo yehei bein zel hazeh shloisha. We need that the gaps in between these thin, narrow slats should be less than 3 tfachim, in which case it's lavud, it's considered to be closed up and non-existent, and the entire wall is considered to be fully built. So even if you have little sticks lined up next to each other, but the gap in between is less than a shiur of lavud, less than 3 tfachim, it's considered to be kulai oimid, as if it's totally, completely built. So it needs to be less than 3, because 3 is already considered to be a gap. It's considered to be space. Kedei shelo yisdaker hagdi, so that the goat will not be able to jump through bevas roish easily. So that's the shiur of 3 tfachim. That allows the traffic through, allows the goat to get through easily. So if it's less than 3, we don't have that concern. It's considered to be fully closed up. That's the first halach. Number 2, kol shu gimel. If we have boards which are 3 tfachim wide, umigimel va'adalat, or anywhere from 3 up until 4, not including 4. In this case, sorech shelo yehei bein zel hazeh k'meloyai. The space between these boards needs to be less wide than the actual boards themselves. Why? Because otherwise you have a problem. Kedei shelo yehei parts ka'imid. So that the parts, the space in between the boards, should not equal in size to the width of the oimid, of the standing portion. In which case, it will be problematic. Now, if the parts area, if the gaps, the spaces in between these boards total more than the built portions themselves, in this case, the oimid is batal. Too many gaps here. Af keneged oimid aser. So even the oimid is batal. You can't even plant alongside those boards, because the parts is larger in size, greater in area. The sum total of these spaces exceed the oimid. The oimid is batal. And even the boards themselves are considered to be batal. You can't even plant next to the board itself. So you can't put 1 min on one side of the board and another min on the other side. Everything is batal. The third halacha, says the brisa, kol shu daled. If we have a 4 tefach wide board, humarba ad eser amis, from 4 until 10 amis wide. In this case, sorech shelo yehei bein zel hazeh k'meloyai. You must ensure that the space between these boards does not equal the size of the boards themselves. Shelo yehei parts ka'imid, so that the parts, the space should not equal in size to the size of the oimid. V'mahaya parts ka'imid. In this case, even if it's exactly the same amount, you have the parts, and which equals the size of the oimid. So it's 50-50. Keneged the oimid mutter. Keneged that part, it's aser. So in this case, although the oimid is batal, and we don't view it as a mechitza because there's too many gaps here, but since we're speaking about a large size board, we're speaking about a board which is at least 4 tefachim wide, that has significance to it, to itself, meaning even if it's just freely standing, if there's too many gaps here, and the mechitza in its entirety is batal. Nevertheless, this board, this freestanding board, so to speak, has its own significance, and therefore the Brisa says, "Keneged the oimer mutter." You could plow, you could plant keneged the oimer right next to, alongside this board, because it has its own significance. It's covering an area 4 tefachim. Keneged apar is also, but alongside the gaps you cannot plant because the place is not considered to be enclosed. It's mechitza, is batal. Concludes the Brisa, "V'imhaya oimed merubah laparetz." What if the oimed portion, the standing built portion, is greater in size than the paretz? Af keneged aparetz mutter. So in the final count, we have more built portions than empty spaces. In this case, it's just the opposite. The oimed portion is mevatels, nullifies these spaces. And we consider this whole area to be fully enclosed. And you can go plant right even next to the paretz, even next to the gaps. What if we have a pirza, a breach which is more than 10 amas wide? That's no longer regarded as a pesach. That's a pirza, says the Brisa Asur. The entire mechitza is also because the mechitza is meant to contain, to prevent traffic from entering. If you have a huge hole which is greater than 10 amas, which is no longer considered a pesach, then this mechitza is dysfunctional. It's not preventing traffic from entering. The entire enclosure becomes nullified, and you cannot plant within this enclosure, no matter which will present a problem of kalayim. If you have these smooth sticks that are inserted in the ground, and he braids a branch alongside the poles, on top of the pole he stretches a branch from one pole to the other, creating a tzuras ha-pesach, a physical configuration of a doorway. In this case, as the Brisa, afilu b'yosim esem mutter, even if it's wide in 10 amas, that's okay because it's tzuras ha-pesach. When it comes to separating between two minim of kalayim, can even be wider than 10 amas. So in summary, we had 3 halachas in the Brisa. Number 1, a gap which is less than 3 tefachim is lava, is considered to be fully closed. If it's 3 tefachim or larger, that's considered to be a space, a pirza. Then we have to go ahead and measure, calculate what's more. Is it more oimid or more paretz in the sum total of this mechitza? And the Brisa continues and says, if we have an oimid which is chashav, is significant, it's 4 tefachim wide. In this case, even if the mechitza in its totality is batal, but this specific board has its own inherent significance, and one can go and plant alongside the board itself. Continues the Gemara, Katani Miyas Reisha. In any rate, the Brisa begins and says, the Gemara is going to analyze this Brisa in view of our machlekes between Rav Papa and Rav Huna ben Yeshua, whether a case where you have 50-50, half oimid and half paretz, is that considered a mechitza? So let's take a look at the Brisa again. Katani Miyas Reisha. At any rate, the Brisa begins by saying, Megimel v'adalit. If you have a board which is anywhere from 3 tefachim to 4 tefachim, so this was the middle case of the Brisa. The Brisa tells you that's okay, even when there are gaps in between those slats, provided that the space in between these boards are not equal in size to the boards themselves. Apparently, when the pirza is equal in size to the oimid, that's a problem. To Rav Papa. This is a kasha of Papa who says that it's fine. Rav Papa. When the Brisa says that the space in between these boards should not equal the size of milui of the board themselves, it means nichnas v'yoytze. There's enough space to put that board in and out, meaning enough wiggle room. There's a little space to breathe, to put the board in and out, which actually means that the space is larger than the board itself. In which case, the gap in between the two boards is actually larger in size than the board next to it. So it's not equal, it's not paretz ki'oimid, it's paretz merubah la'oimid, and that's why it's a problem. This seems to be the correct approach. Because the Brisa itself continues and says, If the parutz was greater, larger in number, larger in size than the oimid, in this case it's batal. Av keneged the oimid aser, and time mechitza is batal, you can't even plant next to the oimid. That's only because the parutz is greater, it exceeds the oimid. Ha ke oimid mutar. Apparently, if it's equal in size to the oimid, it's mutar. Shma mina. This is a raya like my shit. If so, it's a kasha on the other shit. Lema tehavet yufte. Should we say this is a refutation of the Rav Huna Beit Avishur? It tells us that when the parutz and oimid are both equal, it's not a mechitza. This brisa indicates otherwise, that it's okay. Amalach, he'll respond to you as follows. According to your approach, you'll have something else difficult with this brisa. Ema Seifa. Let's take a look at the Seifa of the brisa, which says, Imo ya oimid, merubal parutz. If the oimid portion was larger and greater than the parutz, av keneged that parutz mutter. In this case, the parutz is bottled to the oimid. The entire area is fully enclosed. You can even plant next to the parutz. Apparently, it's only because the oimid exceeds the parutz. Ha ke parutz. What if both amounts are equal? The oimid and the parutz both encompass the same amount of space. Awesome. So you see 50-50 is no good. So the brisa here implies like my shit. Okay, so sum total, we have a problem. The seifa is kasher of papa. The last part of the brisa, which indicates that 50-50 is no good, is a kasher of papa, who says it is good. Whereas reisha, which indicates that's only because the parutz is meruba is a problem, but 50-50 is fine, that's a kasher. Who says that it's not fine. Says the Gemara, each shita will answer the brisa according to his opinion. Seifa of papa like kasher. The last part of the brisa, which says that when it's oimid meruba, it's okay, indicating that it's 50-50, it's no good. That won't be a kasha to Rav Papa. Because the phrase that the brisa is employing in the seifa is merely in contrast to the phrase that he used in the reisha, but it's not really precise, it's not really trying to tell you that halacha. He's merely grabbing that phrase in contrast to the reisha. I did this on a reisha, on account of the fact that the brisa began by saying parutz meruba ala oimid is no good, because 50-50 is good. So on account of that phrase, the brisa merely picked an opposing phrase in contrast to the phrase in the reisha with parutz is meruba, and it's no good. Tana Seifa, the Seifa used a similar phrase, just in the opposite. Oimid meruba ala parutz. If the oimid is greater, then it is good. But certainly, even if it would be 50-50, it would be just fine. Says the Gemara, the same thing regarding the other shit. Reisha, Rav Huna Beit Avishur like kasha. The reisha, which indicates that the problem only begins when it's more parutz than oimid. Apparently, if it's 50-50, it's fine. Which seems to be in contrast to Rav Huna Beit Avishur. Says the Gemara, not necessarily. That's not a kasha. The same idea. The more precise phrase is in the seifa. The phrase in the reisha merely is being employed in contrast to the phrase in the seifa, but it's not really precise. The boy lemisna seifa. So the kasha. So the Gemara is saying it's like kasha from the diak of the reisha, because the boy lemisna seifa. Since the brisa wanted to speak about in the seifa of a case of oimid meruba ala parutz, that if the oimid is greater than the parutz, then it's fine, because 50-50 isn't fine. So that's the precise halacha in the seifa. On account of that, Tana Reisha, the brisa used a similar term in the reisha, just in contrast. Parutz meruba ala oimid. When the parutz is greater than the oimid, then it's a problem. So it's merely on account of the seifa's term, where the brisa simply wanted to contrast it with a similar term. So the seifa spoke about oimid meruba is fine, because 50-50 isn't. So on account of that, the brisa began by saying, well, parutz meruba is a problem, but certainly if it would be 50-50, it would also be a problem. You don't need parutz meruba. So according to him, the seifa is the precise term, and the reisha was merely on account to contrast itself with the seifa. Okay, now let's go back to the brisa, which began by saying that when the gap is less than 3 tvachim, it's considered to be sosam. It's loved. It's fully built and enclosed. If it's 3 tvachim, that's beyond loved. It's considered to be a gap. It's considered to be a pirtz. Now, what happens when you have a 3 tefach wide slat board with 3 tefach gap next to it? So according to Rav Papa, that's perfectly fine, because he holds when the gap equals the built portion, paretz kaimet, it's mutter. So according to him, we understand why the Brisa, in its first halacha, did not want to discuss a case of a board which is 3 tefachim wide. Because in the first halacha, the Brisa was saying, well, only a gap which is less than 3 tefachim is okay, but if it's 3 tefachim, that's a problem. But a 3 tefach wide board that has a gap of 3 tefachim, that's not a problem according to our Papa. Papa. It certainly makes sense according to our Papa, Mishum Hachi. That's the reason why Lo Yaravlu, V'Tanarlu, why the Brisa initially did not direct its first halacha to a case where the board was 3 tefachim wide, because according to our Papa, it wouldn't work. Even if the gap is 3 tefachim, it would be kosher if it's a 3 tefach board. So the Brisa in the first halacha, which tells us that a 3 tefach gap causes problems, cannot apply to a case of a 3 tefach board. So you understand why the Brisa initially did not direct that halacha to a 3 tefach board. Ella Rav Huna Beida Vishua, but according to him, that even when it's a 3 tefach board, if it has a 3 tefach gap next to it, that's a problem. It's paretz kaimet. So why didn't the Brisa include this scenario in its first halacha, which was telling us that only a gap which is less than 3 tefachim is considered to be loved, closed up and built. But if it's 3 tefachim, that's aver, that poses a problem. Then the Brisa proceeded to tell us that if we have a 3 tefach board, so if it's anywhere from 3 up until 4, then if there's a gap which equals the size of that board, that's a problem. Why didn't the Brisa include the scenario of the 3 tefach board that has alongside a 3 tefach gap? That's a problem. Why didn't it include it in the first halacha of the Brisa, which told us that a 3 tefach gap poses a problem? Says the Gemara, Ella Rav Huna Beida V'Shua, who says that a 3 tefach board which has a 3 tefach gap next to it is possible. Why didn't the Brisa include this case in the first concept, in the first scenario, in the first category of the Brisa, that a 3 tefach gap poses a problem? The Brisa should have said, when you have a slat, a board which is less than 3 tefach wide, even if it's 3 tefachim wide, you must make sure the space between these boards does not equal 3 tefachim. But in reality, the Brisa didn't do so. It's only the second category where the Brisa included the slat which is 3 tefachim wide. The Brisa in the second case said, well, when you have a 3 tefach board from 3 up until 4, and there is avir between those boards which equal the size of those boards, then you have a problem. Why didn't the Brisa include this case of a 3 tefach board with a 3 tefach gap in the first halach of the Brisa, which told us that a gap which is 3 tefachim poses a problem? Says the Gemara, because you have to realize that these 2 halachas in the Brisa reflect 2 different concerns. The Brisa is teaching us 2 different concepts. The Brisa initiates by telling us, you should know, that when there's an aver less than 3, it's considered to be fully closed off. It's not even considered to be space. It's love, it's fully built. Up until 3 tefachim. When the gap reaches 3 tefachim, that's called space. That's number 1, first concept. The Brisa proceeds to tell us another concept. That's the second category of the Brisa. That when you have gaps, aver, large spaces, 3, larger than 3, that also can be okay, theoretically, provided that in the sum total of this mechitza, the parts does not equal the aymet. The gaps don't equal the build space. That's another concept above and beyond the first halacha. That's a greater chiddush the Brisa is introducing us to. Therefore, the Brisa preferred to include this case of the 3 tefach board with the 3 tefach gap in the second halacha of the Brisa, which was an additional chiddush above and beyond the first halacha. Says the Mishum Deloy Domi Psula L'Reisha. The concern in the first halacha of the Brisa, the first concept, is different. L'Psula the Sefer. It's different. It doesn't compare to the Psul in the second concept of the Brisa. Psula the Reisha, the concept discussed, the concern discussed initially in the Brisa, is regarding the concept of lavud. If it's less than 3 tefachim, fully built, fully sasam. If it's 3 tefachim, then the goat can get through. It's considered to be a gap. That's one concept you need to know. Kadesh leizdakar agdiv vasachas. You need to have a space which doesn't allow the did to get through. That's one concept, a basic concept of Lobot. Whereas the second concept being introduced by the Brisa, Psula de Seifa, is telling us a chiddush. Even when you have a gap, your mechitza could be kosher, provided shelo yehi paretz ka'omed, that the pirtza, the gap, should not equal in size to the omed. That's an additional chiddush above and beyond the basic first concept told us by the Brisa. Therefore, the Brisa opted and preferred to include this case of the 3 tefach board, which features a 3 tefach gap next to it, in the second category of the Brisa, which teaches us that the concept there is, because the purse is equal to the omed, you have a problem. That's an additional chiddush above and beyond the first halacha, and therefore the Brisa included this case in the second halacha. Continues the Gemara, so we spoke about the halacha of Lobot. If it's less than 3, it's not reckoned with. Once the gap is 3 tefachim, that's a shiur chashav, a prominent number, a prominent amount, and that's considered to be a space. Pachas mishloisha mani. Whose shita is reflected here? That less than 3 is not significant, and it's considered to be closed up, but 3, that's already a shiur chashav. Who is this shita? Rabbanani. The amri pachas mishloisha amri in lavud. When something is less than 3, it's not reckoned with, we consider it to be fully closed off. Shloisha, once you get to 3, that's a prominent number. Lo yamrin and lavud. If that's the case, let's proceed along the Brisa. Ema Seifa. What does the Brisa say? Kol shu shloisha. When you have a 3 tefach board, umar shloisha vad arba, from 3 up until 4, not including 4. What do we say? That even if there are many gaps, that since, in a case where there are many gaps, there's parts that are being mevatel the omed, then everything is batel, and you can't even plant alongside the omed. Everything is gone. The omed is batel to the parts. But the Brisa proceeds in the third case there. If we have a large board, which is 4 tefachim wide, that's considered to be a significantly sized board. It's 4 tefachim. In which case, even if the entire mechitza is batel, you can still plant alongside that board. Because that freestanding board, so to speak, holds its own ground. Because 4 tefachim, number 4, that's chashav. That seems to be incompatible with the Rabbanon, who established number 3 as the chashav number, not number 4. Says the Gemara, Asan, this appears to be following Rav Shimon Gamliel, who sets 4 as the important number. The Amar Pachas Ma'arba. Whenever we have a gap less than 4, if it hasn't yet reached 4, it's love, it's closed off. Because only 4 is considered to be prominent. The Rabbanon, because if we're following Rabbanon, what do you mean Mishloisha vad arba? If the board is anyway from 3 to 4, not including 4, it can be batel, but if it's 4, then it's chashav. What do you mean? Shloisha v'arba chadu. 3 and 4 are the same according to Rabbanan. Once you reach 3, that's a prominent number. That's a large-sized board. It's 3, because they consider 3 to be important. So 3 and 4 are the same. How could the Brisa split between 3 that's not important and 4 that's important? So apparently this is following another shita that holds 4 to be important. Amar Abaye. No, it's all following the Rabbanan. With the Reish Rabbanan, just as the Reish is Rabbanan, apparently Seifa Nami Rabbanan. The Seifa as well follows the Rabbanan, that generally consider 3 to be an important number. But this case is different. Ummay the Rabbanan agree. And we have a case where mechitza is batel, and you have a freestanding board somewhere in the middle there. To allow planting alongside that board, 3 is not enough. 3 is said regarding closing a gap, but it's not really a positive element. To make it into a positive, prominent feature, it needs to have 4. The kol mishra connected, to allow this board to permit planting alongside it as a freestanding, independent entity. Only if it's partitioning a space of 4 tefachim, that's a shir makim chashiv, and this thing is chashiv, meaning we reckon with it, we give it significance and prominence. V'iloi, but if it's not enclosing an area of 4, loy chashiv, it doesn't have adequate prominence. So Abaye splits the two. When we're speaking about a whole, yeah, magic number is 3. If it's less than 3, it's closed. Once it's 3, it's too big to be considered closed. But when we're speaking about a positive element, to create something of prominence, a mechitza, you need to have 3. You need to have 4. And therefore, if the board is 4 tefachim, which is partitioning a chashav area 4 tefachim, then we can reckon with it on its own, but otherwise not. Rav Amar, just the opposite. The entire Brisa is Rav Shimon Gamliel. Mid the Sefer Rabban Shimon Gamliel. Apparently, since the second part of the Brisa, which sets the number of chashivas at 4, the freestanding board needs to be 4, is Rav Shimon Gamliel's shita, who considers 4 to be chashiv. Reisha Nami, Rav Shimon Gamliel. Apparently, the Reisha as well, discussing holes, and sets the number at 3, is actually his shita as well. How? V'chi Amar Rav Shimon Gamliel Amrina Lavud. When does he hold that Lavud is up until 4 tefachim? Anything less than 4 is not reckoned with. That's only when you have a hole suspended up in the air. For instance, the case where the kaira up on top wasn't reaching the wall. So it's not down on the ground. If it's less than 4 tefachim, it's considered to be one and connected. Avalamata. When the hole, the gap is found down below on the floor, where it needs to serve as a partition, preventing traffic from going through, even he would agree that once you reach the point of 3 tefachim, it allows the goats to get through, and therefore it's ineffective. It's like a mechitza like gdoyim. Goats jump right through. We can't apply lavud. So in theory, he holds lavud is up until 4, because 4, and only 4, is considered to be a shiur chashiv, just as we find regarding that board. If it's 4, it's prominent. But when it comes to lavud on the floor, down on the bottom, if it's merely 3 tefachim, that also negates the mechitza. Continues the Gemara, getting back to our discussion what we have in mechitza, which is half built and half unbuilt. Rav Papa says it's okay. Rav Huna ben Yeshua says it's not. Tashma, let me bring you a raya to one of these shittas. The Brisa says, Tfanes halolu, these walls surrounding a courtyard. Shiur and psachim v'chalonis. That is mostly gaps. Entranceways, psachim, chalonis, windows, full of holes. Mutter, it's okay. Provided it's mostly built. How are these two things compatible? Sherub and salkadaitach? You think we're speaking about mostly gapped? If it's mostly psachim chalayin, how can you proceed and say, well, it's mostly oimid? It's either one or the other. Ella rather, sharibu behem psachim chalayin. The Bryce is saying he increased, he fashioned numerous a riboy of entranceways and windows. Mutter, that could be mutter. Ubaval shehei oimid merubal parts. Provide that in the sum total of things, and upon analysis, there is more built and unbuilt. Says the Gemara, apparently, if it's not more oimid, rather it is equal to parrots, 50-50, it's no good. Tiyufta Rav Papa. This will be a kasha Rav Papa, who says that it's fine. Says the Gemara, indeed, tiyufta, it's a refutation. And the Allah follows Rav Papa that it's fine. Says the Gemara, what do you mean? Tiyufta v'hilchasa? First you refute, and then you say, we follow that shita? Yes. Mishum de daika masnisen kavasei. Although this brisa seems to be inconsistent with our Papa, but our Mishnah on Daf Tezvav, the wording in our Mishnah indicates Rav Papa's halacha, because the Mishnah there is speaking about the caravan which are surrounding themselves with animal accessories to make a mechitza. The Mishnah tells you the Mishnah tells us lo yehu pirtzei siser salabinyan. If you have these gaps, make sure that the amount of the pirza doesn't surpass and exceed the binyan. That implies, binyan, if the pirza is equal in size to the binyan, it's fine, mutter. So apparently, 50-50 is fine, just like Rav Papa's shita. So in summary, we had a brisa that taught us. Number one, if a gap is less than 3 tefachim, that's not considered to be a gap, that's sasim. The brisa discussed using sticks, which are anywhere up until 3 tefachim, full of gaps and holes. So if it's less than 3 tefachim, those gaps are sasim. And it's considered to be fully standing because a gap which is less than 3 does not have a din of space. The Brisa proceeded to talk about a 3 tefach wide board, from anywhere from 3 to 4 tefachim, not including 4 tefachim, and there's a pirza in between them, which equals the size of those slats. That has a din of a pirza. So if the parrot's area is greater in number, greater in size than the oimid, the whole thing is batal. Even alongside the oimid, you cannot plant because everything is batal to the gaps. Whereas if you have a board which is 4 tefachim wide, which has prominence and chashivas, and there's a gap in between those boards which equal in size to those boards, that's called a pirza. And if you have more pirza in sum total than the oimid, the entire thing is batal. But since those boards are large size boards, you can go ahead and plant alongside those freestanding boards. Whose opinion is reflected in this brisa? Says Abaye. It's reflecting the Rabbanan, who hold that 3 is a number which is chashiv. Therefore, a gap less than 3 is lavud. But when it comes to the freestanding board, that needs to encompass a makom chashiv, needs to be 4 tefachim wide. Rava says just the opposite. From the halacha of the freestanding board, which needs to be 4 tefachim, it appears we're following Shiur Gamliel, who considers 4 to be a prominent number. But when it comes to lavud down on the ground, this gap, which is right near the floor, he agrees it would only work if it's less than 3 tefachim. Continues the Mishnah, Ma'akifin shloisha chavalim. So getting back to this group of travelers who would like to enclose their camp to allow carrying within, says the Mishnah they can actually use ropes, just ropes, to create a mechitza. Ma'akifin shloisha chavalim. They surround their area with merely 3 ropes. So we have these ropes which are running horizontally around this camp. The first rope within 3 tefachim to the ground, which creates an enclosure, it's lavud. So presumably these ropes are being supported by poles. So we have 3 ropes. Number 1 on the bottom, within 3 tefachim to the ground. Zel l'malam mizeh. Then we have another rope on top of that first rope within 3 tefachim. Zel l'malam mizeh. We have a third rope yet running along the top of this mechitza, this 10 tefachim mechitza, within 3 tefachim to the rope below it. So it's a total of 3 ropes running within 3 tefachim of each other, which creates a mechitza of 10 tefachim. Provided that the gap between the ropes is less than 3 tefachim. There should not be shloisha tefachim. So within 3 tefachim is lavud, it's considered to be enclosed, and you have a full mechitza. So you have 3 gaps here, one between the ground and the first rope, which is less than 3 tefachim. We have another gap between that rope and the second rope, another gap between the second and third rope. So in total we have a bit less than 9 tefachim here in height. So how do you get to 10 tefachim? Very simple. The ropes themselves have to total. They have to have a thickness combined between all 3 of a bit more than a tefach. So you add that to the area which is a bit less than 9. You get 10 tefachim. Shiur chavalim ovyon yasser al tefach. What is the shear of the thickness of the ropes? So all 3 ropes combined need to be a bit more than a tefach. So if you'll add it to the rest of the area, you'll have 10 tefachim. Kadeshi hey hakol asar tefachim. So you have a total of 10 tefachim. So this is one example of a improperly constructed fence. It only has a horizontal element to it. It's called mechitza shel erev. It's a horizontal mechitza, and that works. Continues the Mishnah with another example. Mekifin b'kanim. They can surround the area merely using kanim, sticks, reeds, which are lined up next to each other. Insert in the ground, facing upward. So it's a vertical mechitza. It only has a vertical element to it. And they're lined up next to each other with small spaces. Provided the space between one stick and the next is not shloisha tefachim. So you have less than 3 tefachim, which creates lavud. So all the sticks are considered to be one combined mechitza, one continuous oimed, and this provides mechitza. Says the Mishnah, b'shayora dibru. This was only pertaining to a shayora, a caravan. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. These mechitzas are flimsy mechitzas. It either contains only the element of erev. The ropes are only horizontal mechitzas, because not starting from the ground up. So it's considered to be a mechitza shel erev. Whereas the kanim, which are planted in the ground, so they rise from the ground up, but they only contain the element of shesi. They only have that vertical element to them. It's not a properly constructed, fully supported mechitza, which generally has both elements. It has something going this way, upward, something going sideways to support itself. This is doesn't really have that residential quality to it. This can only be applied to the shayur. These fellows that are traveling en route, this caravan, Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Perhaps due to their difficult situation, they allow them to establish this mechitza, or perhaps since this is your typical mechitza, which people do, which people construct when they're on the road. So for them, this is considered to be a proper mechitza. No, this could pertain to any person, any traveling person, not even a group together. The reason why the Mishnah mentions shayara, not to imply that individuals traveling cannot employ these mechitzas. It's merely a typical example. Who needs this mechitza? Generally, it's the shayara. That's generally who's traveling, a group of people. But certainly, even a yachid individual can go ahead and travel using these mechitzas. Continues the Mishnah, called mechitza she'ena shel shesi shel erev. Any mechitza that does not employ both aspects. It doesn't have both dimensions of shesi and erev together, vertical and horizontal dimensions. Eina mechitza, that's not considered to be a proper mechitza. Divrei Rabbi Yosef Bar Yehuda. No, echad mishnei dvarim, as long as it employs one of these two elements, either vertical or horizontal, that is sufficient to create a mechitza. Amar Rav Nuna, Amar Rav. Hari Amru, the Chachamim told us, we know, that oimed meruba la parts. That's why we have a mechitza that has empty spaces. But it is mostly built. It's oimed meruba la parts. Bishesi, in reference to a mechitza of shesi, meaning it's rising from the ground up. For instance, the example we had in the earlier Mishnah of this group of people traveling and they encircle their camp with animal accessories. So those are positioned on the ground. They're coming from the ground up. They're considered to be shesi, vertical mechitzas. So even if they have spaces between, there's parts there, but as long as it's mostly built, mostly oimid, that's okay. The spaces are considered to be entranceways, psachim. Have oimid. That's considered to be oimid. Be'erev amnuna, be'erev mai. Can we apply this concept to a mechitza shel erev, a horizontal mechitza? For instance, those ropes, which aren't really beginning from the ground up, they have a horizontal dimension to them. What if they have gaps? So the case now, Mishnah actually doesn't have really gaps because they're less than 3 tefachim, which is loved. What if we have real parts, we have spaces larger than 3 tefachim within that mechitza shel erev, that horizontal mechitza? Perhaps here, since it's not really starting from the ground up, so those gaps in there are not considered to be doorways, entranceways, they're just holes in the wall. Do we employ this concept there as well? Do we say, well, if in the final analysis of things the sum total of the oimid exceeds the parts, that's okay? Or do we say, if there's a parts in there, if there's a gap greater than 4, greater than 3, it is mevatel the mechitza. Be'erev mai. Amar Abaye Tashma, listen to the raya from our Mishnah. The Mishnah tells us that you string 3 ropes, one on top of the other, and the space in between those ropes is less than 3 tefachim. The ropes themselves, combined, need to have a thickness of a bit more than a tefach. So we work out a mechitza of 10 tefachim in total. Between the ropes and the gaps, we have 10 tefach. Shiur chavolam v'oivyon, what is the actual thickness of those ropes? Yosar tefach, a bit more than a tefach. Shiur koil asar tefachim, because when you combine it with those gaps, each one being less than 3, for a total of a bit less than 9, plus this tefach and a bit of the ropes themselves, you have 10 tefach. V'isa. Now if you maintain that even when there is parts, when there are gaps, when there are real spaces in this type of mechitza shel erev, that's okay, as long as the sum total of the oimid exceeds the parts. So why do we need the ropes to have that thickness combined of a tefach and more? Lama li yasr al tefach. Why can't he construct his rope mechitza using thin ropes? As follows: Li abed pachas mishloisha v'chevel mashu. Let him take a chevel mashu, a thin rope, and run it within 3 tefachim to the ground. So that closes that off. Then upachos mishloisha v'chevel mashu. Take another chevel mashu, a thin rope. Place it within 3 tefachim of the first rope. So now you have a total of 6 tefachim of your mechitza. So most of this mechitza is oimid. Now you don't need any more. Upachos marbo v'chevel mashu. Take the next thin rope and string it 3 tefachim within 4 tefachim, which is beyond lavud of that second rope. So it's considered to be a perza, but it shouldn't pose a problem because in the total analysis of this mechitza, it's mostly oimid. The first 6 has been closed off through lavud. So that should be mevatel, the perza, which is above them. So why does the Mishnah require a thick rope in order to get that configuration and have only a little less than 3 tefachim between each rope to create a complete mechitza with 3 lavuds working combined? You don't need 3 lavuds. As long as you have the first 2 sections are lavud, that provides 6 tefachim, which is the majority of the oimid. Oimid, the berurah parts, should be considered to be fully built. Apparently, you don't employ this concept of oimid merubah lapart by mechitza shel erev. So if you have this gap which is larger than lavud, up on top of that mechitza, it's more than 3 tefachim, it's mevatel the mechitza. So it's a right to Rav Nuna's question. Says the Gemara, not so quick. V'tizbra. Can you really think that this would work? Meaning, aside from Rav Nuna's question, this case here will involve other difficulties. There are other concerns here which will prevent it from working. Let's analyze. This large gap, 4 tefachim, a little bit less than 4 tefachim. Where exactly in this mechitza is it located? Where is he going to position it? Meaning, where is it going to be, on top, in the middle, on bottom? If he's placing that gap of 4 on the bottom portion of the mechitza, meaning that the first rope is placed at a distance of a bit less 4 than the ground below, that poses another problem, another concern. It lets the traffic through and nullifies the entire mechitza. There's nothing to talk about here. It's like a mechitza where goats get through it. That certainly wouldn't work. So if he places that large gap on top of the mechitza, meaning you have less than 3, then less than 3, which creates 6, and then on the top layer he has the 4 tefach gap. That wouldn't work either, for another reason. Because that string that's all the way on top of the 10 tefachim is surrounded by both sides with spaces that are much greater, much larger than it. Because below it you have the 4 tefachim, and above it you open to the sky above. That wouldn't work because it's going to be mavatal, that rope. The gap, the air on one side of that string, the haigisa, and the space on the other side will come along to combine to nullify that rope. So that wouldn't work either. If he places this 4 tefach gap in the middle of his mechitza, so you have 11 on bottom, 11 on top, that also wouldn't really work. Because although in the total amount of the mechitza, which is 10 tefachim, you have mostly oimid, you have 3 tefachim 11 on bottom, 3 tefachim 11 on top, which makes it for oimid merubal parts is more standing, more built and unbuilt. It's 6 versus 4. But let's keep in mind that these 2 built portions are not next to each other. They're on 2 sides of this large gap of 4 tefachim. Who says you can combine those 2 built portions together to nullify that large gap, which is greater in size than the oimid which is sitting next to it? Havali oimid merubal parts. True, you have in total amount you have oimid greater than parts, 6 against 4, but it's mishtei ruchas. You need to combine 2 separate built portions. How do you know that works? Shamas mina. Are you going to imply that oimid merubal parts, mishtei ruchas, that such a type of oimid merubal will work? Have oimid? Not necessarily so. Meaning, what's Rav Nuna's question? We can't figure out a scenario where his question would apply. Rav Nuna asked, let's say you have this inferior mechitza, shel erev. It's not coming from the ground up, it's hovering above the ground. Perhaps the concept of oimed beruba would not apply here due to the inferiority of this mechitza. That seems to be the only problem, because it's mechitza shel erev, perhaps it's inferior to mechitza shel sesi, where oimed beruba does work. Says Abaye, we can't even get started here. Because any which way that you configure your question, your scenario, you're running into another problem. So what was Rav Nuna's question to begin with? Says the Gemara, Ela Rav Nuna, apparently Rav Nuna's question applied to the following scenario, which will avoid any of these pitfalls we just mentioned. Kigoin, for instance, the Aisi Machzeles, to have a Zayne Mashu. He brought along a mat, a solid mat, which is 7 tefachim long. 7 and a bit. And he carved out a hole, a gap of 3 tefachim, which is more than love it. It's actually considered to be space, 3 tefachim, in this mat. And he left the other portion of the mat intact, dal de mashu, 4 tefachim plus a bit. So you have a mat here, where, for instance, the top portion is intact, 4 tefachim. You have a gap of 3 tefachim, empty space, and right below that gap, it's framed in by the bottom of the machzelas, of the mat. And he suspended it, he placed it within 3 tefachim to the ground, which is loved. So that bottom portion is considered to be fully enclosed. So in this case, you avoid all the pitfalls. Why? Because the bottom portion doesn't allow goats through. It's fully enclosed, it's loved. The top portion, which is intact, is greater in size than the gap below it, which is only 3 tefachim. So that won't become nullified. And the intact portion here is one continuous oimid. You don't need to combine 2 oimids. So you addressed all your concerns. The question remains, Rav Huna's question. When we have a mechitza shel erev, such as this one, because it's not coming from the ground up, it's hovering above the ground, it's considered to be a horizontal mechitza, which is mostly oimed. Do we say that oimed merubal apartz works in this case or not? Rav Ashi Amar, the question of Rav Huna pertains to the following scenario. Mechitza tzluyi boile. This question pertains to a hanging mechitza. You have a mechitza of 10 tfachim. The problem is it's not reaching the ground below. It's suspended above the ground, 3 tfachim above the ground. Does that work? As Rav Tavla, Rabbi Tavla asked Rav, mechitza tluya? A suspended mechitza. Can allow carrying. And in chorvei ruins, this is a typical example, a typical case where you have incomplete mechitzas which are coming from above but not reaching the ground below. Does that work? Amalei, he told him no. Ein mechitza tluya materes el b'mayim. This type of hovering mechitza will only be effective when it comes to water. When you're trying to enclose an area of water to allow drawing from within it, Chacham said this type of mechitza can work there. It's not a traveled area. It's not a dry ground. It separates the water within from the water outside of it. Kalu shekilu chacham b'mayim. That's a special leniency that Chacham applied to water. But on dry land, the mechitza is only effective if it stretches down and reaches the ground below. So in summary, Rav Nuna had a question whether the concept of oimed merubal apartz will apply to mechitza shel erev, this horizontal hovering mechitza. The Gemara presented 2 scenarios where this question could apply, either this mat or the mechitza tluya. On the first question, the Gemara didn't seem to really resolve it. Regarding the mechitza tluya, the Gemara did seem to resolve it that it will not work if it's on dry land. Continues the Gemara, ma'akifim b'kanam b'chul. So Rav Yehuda tells us in the Mishnah that this type of incomplete mechitzas, which only contain one of 2 elements, either only vertical or only horizontal, that's not considered to be a proper mechitza. That doesn't really have a residential quality to it. And Rav Yehuda tells us this will only apply to shayara, a group of people, 3 people, a caravan traveling. The shayara in b'yachad loy, it won't apply to an individual. He can't use this. V'atanya, having in the Brayis Rabbi Doimer, kol mechitzas Shabbos, all these types of incomplete, improperly constructed mechitzas, when it comes to Shabbos, lo yitiru leyachad yois meisasayim. They did not allow an individual to make use of this type of mechitza unless he's enclosing a small enough area. It can't be larger than 2 saw, a place where you plant 2 saw of seeds, so it's 100 amos by 50, which equals the shiur of the Chatzar HaMishkan, courtyard around the Mishkan, which in itself was not really a residentially enclosed area. So these non-residential mechitzas can only affect and make a contained area if the place is small enough in size which is considered to be appropriate for personal use, thereby making these mechitzas effective and turning into shayachat. But if it's too large an area, using these improperly constructed mechitzas for a large area, that gives the impression of a non-residential enclosure. It looks like it resembles an open area, a field, a forest, which is considered a calmless midrabanan. But nevertheless, we see that a yachid can employ these mechitzas, provided that it's a small enough area. How is this compatible with the indication, with the words in our Mishnah, that it can only be used for shayara? Says the Gemara, even Rabbi Yehuda agrees that a yachid can use it. The question is, how large an area is enclosing? Could the Omar of Nachman, as Rav Nachman said, some say it was Rabbi Abaye. So he said it elsewhere. It's going to be coming up in the Gemara soon, in a different context. He said the following statement: it's only needed to provide them an area for all their needs, to allow them to encircle a huge area. So that's what they said, pertaining elsewhere. We're going to apply that phrase here as well, Hachanami here as well. When Rabbi Yehuda limits it, he says, this only applies to a shayara. He didn't mean the concept of this mechitza can only be effective for shayara. He meant that the large size mechitza, you can't encircle a large area according to needs with this type of flimsy mechitza, only if it's a shayara, which typically uses mechitza, for them is considered to be a proper mechitza. But a yachid, he can only use these mechitzas provided it's a small area. Hachanam here as well. When we speak about the yachid not having the same privilege as the shayara, it's litin called tzarchan. It's regarding allowing them an area according to their needs. That only applies to shayara, not a yachid. Says, well, where was that phrase said? Heicha itmar, Rav Nachman. V'itema, some say, where did they employ that phrase of litin called tzarchan? Aha, on this, it's not a went in the Mishnah. Called mechitza she'ena shal shesiv le'erev. Any mechitza does not contain both elements, vertical and horizontal. Eina mechitza. That's not considered to be a mechitza. Divrei Rabbi Yosef Bar Yehuda. Is that so? Umi Amar Rabbi Yosef Bar Yehuda Hachi? That this mechitza is ineffective. V'atani, we learned in a brayso. Echad yachid ve'echad shayar l'chaval. An individual or a caravan can both use a mechitza of ropes. The only difference is the size that they're enclosing. What is the difference between an individual and a group? We grant an individual an area of 2 sa, no more than that. Shnayim, the same thing. Gimel nasu shayar. They become a caravan. We give them a total of 6, allotting 2 per person. So it's very clear that he agrees you can use this type of mechitza, which is a steer to our Mishnah, where he seems to be saying you cannot. Let's first finish the brayso. They say even this vertical or horizontal mechitza is considered to be a properly constructed mechitza. It's considered to be a residential enclosure, and therefore there's no limits. Echad yachad, echad shayara, whether a yachad or a group, noislim kol tzarcham, without them to enclose even a large area according to their needs. Base sosayim pana, provided they don't leave a vacant area, which they don't need. A large area of Beis Hasayim which is unneeded, which turns this whole enclosure into a non-residential enclosure. But otherwise, if they need the area, might be my guest. Go ahead and encircle a huge area. But in any case, getting back to the Rabbi Yehuda, here in the brayso he says, anybody can use a mechitza provided it's small enough in size. Whereas in the Mishnah he says, you cannot. On that we have the teretz. Amar of Nachman. Some say, even he agrees this mechitza is effective, depending how large it is. This that he said in the Mishnah that this mechitza is ineffective, he didn't mean in principle. He meant he meant to say you can't grant this person a huge area according to his needs, only if it's Beis Hasayim more or less. So in summary, we have 3 shittas here regarding this incomplete mechitza of either Shesi or Erev. Rida maintains a yachad can use an enclosure of Beis Hasayim. When it comes to shayara, we grant them as much as they need. Rabbi Yosef says, whether it's a yachad or a shayara, it only has Beis Hasayim. A shayara of 3 people can have 2 sa per person. According to Rabbanan, they consider this to be proper mechitza. Whether a yachad or a shayara, we grant him as much as he or they need. Continues the Gemara regarding the conclusion halacha l'maisa. Darish of Nachman taught Mishun Rabbeinu Shmuel, yachid, if he's only a yachad using this mechitza, noislan Beis Hasayim. He's allowed to encircle 2 sa. Beis, if there are 2 people, noislan Beis Hasayim. Gimel, nasa shayara, they've become a caravan. V'noislan Beis sheish, they can have 6, 2 per person. So this is in accordance with Rav Yosef Yehuda's shit. So they asked him, Shavas Rabbanon, you've abandoned the Rabbanon, v'avdas, and you've done Rav Yosef Yehuda? How could you do that? Hadar ukim Rav Nachman, amoyra alei. Rav Nachman repositioned his announcer who would announce his words to the public, B'darish, and he announced as follows: Dvarim shamartu l'fneichem, the words that I've presented before you, tois hem biyadi, a mistake. Baram, rather, kach amru, this is what the Chacham said. Yachid, if it's only individual, noislam Beis Hasayim. He's granted 2 sa. Shnayim, 2 people, noislam Beis Hasayim. They have a total of 2 sa. So this seems to be consistent with Rabbi Yehuda. Then he proceeded. Shloisha, if there are 3 people, nasa shayara, they become a caravan. For noislam kol tzarchan, we grant them as much as they need. This seems to be found in Rabbanan Shita. Says Reisha, the first part, is a Rabbi Yehuda, who limits it at 2 sa. The Seifa on the second part is the Rabbanon. Says yes. The reason why, in the beginning, when it comes to 1 or 2 people, he said you're limited to 2 sa, is because there are 2 shittas that hold that way. Rabbi Yosef Yehuda, and also the father of Rabbi Yosef Yehuda, who is Rabbi Yehuda. Yes, mishum dekaya vuha b'shitze, because his father also agrees to his opinion. So we have 2 shittas that hold that they're limited at 2 sa. Therefore, when it comes to 1 or 2 people, he followed that opinion, they're limited at 2 sa. When it comes to the shayar, which is a rabbim, in this case, there are no 2 shittas that are limited to 2 sa. Rather, Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanan both hold that they're given as much as they need. Therefore, he concluded accordingly. So in conclusion, we have those 3 shittas. Rabbi Yehuda says a yachid gets 2 sa, a rabbim, a shayara gets as much as they need. Rabbi Yehuda says a yachid gets Beis Hasayim, a shayara gets 2 sa per person. Rabbanan say, whether a yachid or a shayara, we grant them as much as they need. Rav Nachman made a compromise. When it comes to a yachid, he says 2 sa. When it comes to a shayara, as much as they need. Okay, time for a brief review of today's daf. The Gemara began by giving us concepts of mechitzos. There's a gap less than 3 tefachim. It's considered to be fully built. If the gap is 3 or more, that's considered to be a space, a pirza. So if the pirza area equals an area greater than the oimid, that mechitza is batal. You can't even plant next to the oimid. But if the oimid portion, the standing portion, is 4 tefachim or greater, that's considered to be prominent and significant, and you can plant alongside that standing portion. The Gemara discussed the mechitza, which is comprised of one of two elements, either vertical or horizontal. Rav Hamnuna asked the question whether when it comes to a vertical mechitza, can you apply the concept of oimed berubal aparetz, that it's sufficient if it's mostly built? Does that work or not? The Gemara proceeds to tell us, by these types of mechitzas which are improperly constructed, either has only vertical or horizontal elements to it, when it comes to a yachid, he's allowed an area of 2 sa'ah. When it comes to a shayara, as much as any.